now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session. We'll just give a minute or so for more people to come in. And I, as usual, have a little question up there that we encourage you to think about and answer before we get started on the session. So the question that we are inviting you to think about today, before I kickstart the session, is, there's a list of different sorts of identities there: gender, race, ethnicity, class, age, language. And what we're interested in is, which of those identities do you think sometimes might have negative repercussions for your career or your well-being? And, we never know for sure, right? But any thoughts that you have that these might interfere with your career or sometimes create additional stresses for you? So you can do the QR code there if you want to get to the question on Slido more quickly. But I will give just one more minute for you to answer that question. Okay, everyone, I'm going to begin. The question is in, if anyone's missed it, it's in the chat, and do feel free to do that as we are talking. So welcome to our final Women in Research session for this year, webinar number 31. And here we're going to look at this topic of intersectionality. And I'm delighted that we have two ARC Laureate Fellows who we haven't had on the series yet join us today. Professor Lydia Morawski. I should have asked you how to pronounce your name, Lydia. You can tell us later. And Professor Jacqueline Peel. So welcome, guys, and welcome to all of you. It's a busy time of the year, and so we super appreciate that you've been able to come on today. So that's the question. Again, it's in the chat. I'm going to move on from that now. And we do love to see you if you feel comfortable to share your face. But if you can, just mute yourselves. Today, I'm on the land of the people of the Noongar Nation, the Whadjuk people here in lovely Western Australia in Perth. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and do feel free to share in the chat which land you are on and the respect that you pay to our original owners. As always, I encourage you to just focus on the talk, or do your ironing or something like that, but try not to check your emails and things at the same time. We're going to talk about intersectionality. And actually, over the time that we've been running this series, we've had several requests from people. Can we please talk about intersectionality? And so today, delighted that we're going to do that and look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions. So this term was came from somebody called Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a civil rights advocate and lawyer. And actually, she has a TED talk there, which I watched at double speed. So it's really good. And so where does this idea come from? And she described how somebody came to her, a black woman who applied for a job and didn't get a job and thought that she had been discriminated against. And when I believe when it was taken to court or pursued in some sort of legal way, the response was, well, look, we've got lots of women working here in this organisation, and we've got lots of black people working in this organisation, so it can't be discrimination. And that sort of made Kimberly realise that when you have these intersections of identities, in this case being female and being black, there can be disadvantage that's quite unique to that category and group of people, because of course that organisation didn't employ any black women. And she also, as another example of this phenomenon, when she does the TED Talk, she actually shares the names of 4 people at the start. And she says, if you've heard of these names, stay standing up or stand up. And lots of people stand up. And then she puts another 4 names up and says, if you've heard of these people, stand up. And basically hardly anyone stood up. And the first 4 names were black men that had been killed, I think by police. Sorry, I can't quite remember. I watched it quickly, as I said. But the second 4 names were black women that had been killed by police. And what she was basically trying to say is that the black men that had been killed, it was very visible and known, but it was very invisible and unknown when black women had been killed. So that's sort of how she talked about this concept of intersectionality. And I guess since that term has been coined, there has been a lot of research and thinking about this topic. And the definition is now in the Oxford definition dictionary. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, gender, that are created as overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So the idea here isn't just that you sort of add these things up and say, well, I've got a lot of these different categories, so I'm going to be really, really disadvantaged, because they interact together in quite complex ways. And in fact, in the case of black women, the argument was that it's more than just being female and being black. There's something more that occurs from a discrimination perspective when you're a black female. So these compounding effects can occur. And fundamentally, I guess, as with all discrimination, power is often at the heart of a lot of this intersectionality. I think what it means that sort of practically is that, sometimes we can assume that if we're a female, that another female experiences the same sort of discrimination or not as we do. But that is not, appropriate assumption insofar as the experiences can be very, very different depending on these different categories. I know that we've done some research, for example, on the intersectionality of gender and age, and older women can experience some quite unique forms of discrimination relative to, well, younger women, but also to older men. So it is about trying to recognise there's a whole person there at play. The topic of intersectionality has been looked at in lots of different domains, health, domestic violence, and many, many others. As you know, this is a series about work. And so I will share with you some of the research very briefly on work. You can see here, this is a sort of diagram of this idea of intersectionality, where these different categories, social categories and aspects of people come together and collide. And as this is a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, everyone has their own unique experiences of both discrimination and privilege, actually. Why does it matter at work? I'm just basically going to talk about this one review, relatively recent, so I thought it was a good one to use, in 2023. And it reviewed all the studies that it could find on intersectionality in the workplace. And most of the 153 studies that they found were focused on this intersectionality of gender and race or ethnicity. So that was them, and I guess that's partly stems from the history of this concept being focused on Black women, but also I guess it's a very pervasively negative, can be a very pervasively negative combination. It's relevant to think about this in a workplace because organisations can reproduce these social inequalities that are happening out there in society. And that can happen through the human resource policies that the organisation has, the culture, like if it's a long working hours and expectation everyone should work all weekend, that culture, might that have repercussions for some intersectional groups more than others. Interpersonal dynamics, manager behaviours, what our PhD supervisors, for example, might behave in certain ways to members of particular groups that create disadvantage. So that's why we need to look in organisations, because organisations are little microcosms of what's happening out there, but actually can also even sometimes make things worse. So what this research generally shows is that there are compounding negative effects for careers and things like discrimination if you are female and then you have some other disadvantaged identity, which could be disability or religion or ethnicity and race, as we've already talked about, or, where it might be being a refugee or wearing a hijab or any of those sorts of things. Coupled with being female, the research generally shows that has that compounding or even bigger effect than just adding up those two types of discrimination. But it's interesting, though, and this shows the complexity of this area. Sometimes women who've got another disadvantaged identity can have benefits too, right? And so this was one study showed that if you're a lesbian, then you can actually have career benefits. So more career options, stronger relationships with colleagues, and less harassment, basically, if you're in a male-dominated work culture compared to heterosexual women. So there's an example of where the intersectionality of gender and sexuality actually creates an advantage relative to not having that intersectionality. So it can be complex. So what does that mean from a practical perspective? And I just want to share a couple of thoughts on that. From an organisational perspective, like from the university perspective, first of all, one of the things is that, of course, we know, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of focus on what are the diversity, equity and inclusion policies, what support is provided to women or other groups who suffer disadvantage. But what is really, really important is to make sure that if, for example, you're creating policies to support women, it's really important that diverse women are represented in these bodies and involved, because sometimes the solutions might be quite unique for particular groups of intersectionality. So involving people and being as diverse as you can in that process. Of course, we all know that policies are one thing, but another thing is the actual behaviour of your boss, your dean, your supervisor, your research leader. Those individuals, of course, also make an incredible difference to your work experiences. So what we also need to do from an organisational perspective is educate and develop and reward those managers and deans and supervisors to really create more inclusive climates and work designs. It's important, of course, to address power, because this is fundamentally what this is all about. And if the university is run by all white men, then straight away it's going to be difficult to really embed these sorts of practices. What about more personally, if you're someone who's experiencing disadvantage, discrimination, perhaps as a result of intersectionality? What the research shows, and I'm sort of summing up a lot of research fairly briefly here, is it's better to respond actively than passively. So it can feel like, it maybe feels like a easier course of action just to accept the behaviour, but actually that tends to then be associated with a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and a lot of frustration. Actually, the research shows if you can be more active in your response through problem-focused coping, so, actually saying this is a problem, how am I going to change it, or how am I going to address it, or how am I going to get support, or am I going to look for another job? Even deviance, even maybe not doing quite the right thing, sometimes can be a more productive response than just doing nothing. What is identity construction and management? That's thinking about, what does this mean for me? Trying to make sense actively of what's happening and what might that mean. Networking is important because, again, you're building your support base and increasing your exposure to more diverse individuals and so on. So that is probably the main area, and I know that pretty much all of the advice that we always get from the laureates when they share their tips on the Women in Research series, it's mostly about these more active responses. You've got to find the right active response, and that's, of course, not always easy, but doing something as opposed to just accepting it, I guess, is the message from this research. What about if you want to support other people from an intersectionality perspective, as an intersectional ally, or if you are a supervisor or dean or manager? Probably, again, boiling a lot of research down into a couple of points. One is the importance of being aware of your own privilege and reflecting on your different identities and how this impacts your experiences. So a bit of self-awareness and a bit of thinking about, okay, this is how it is for me, but it might not be like this for everyone. And I shouldn't presume that my experiences as a female are the same for other females. They might experience different things, and just reflecting on that, you might then, and I've put here this wheel of power and privilege, that you can see where it comes from, but this idea that sort of the, power tends to align with, being more white, being more educated, being more able-bodied, being more heterosexual, neurotypical, mentally robust, slim, having property, being wealthier, being English, and being more cisgender, male, and having citizenship and white. So the more that you have those sorts of things, that will tend to align with a power, having more power. Might not feel like it, but in a sense, it's these people with a lot of these categories on the outside of this circle that, may experience a bit more of the intersectionality that we're talking about. Yes, and as a comment from Ravani, thank you for sharing. Sometimes the emotional toll of being active can be very draining. Yeah, and, we've talked a lot about that in this series, that how strategic you have to be and how thoughtful, because sometimes, and picking your battles, all those sorts of things, because if you were to constantly push against this stuff, it would just probably wear you down forever. So I think it's about being active, but in a thoughtful and strategic way, that pick your battles. So thanks, Ravani. That's a great comment. The last thing for being an ally is just the importance of listening and learning. I think we can never underestimate how powerful it is to be properly heard. And so listening and trying to be open to other people's, experiences. And so, look, that's a pretty high level and brief overview of some of the challenges around intersectionality. And it's great to see some comments coming into the chat. And I see the comment, as a Black woman, I cannot dare be deviant. And that's certainly something even women more generally can experience, that if women are more deviant or more bolshy, they often will get penalised a lot more than men. That's that classic men are assertive and women are aggressive type of thing, where the same behaviour is perceived very differently. So I think the idea here is, it's very challenging to work out how to be active in your response. It can be active just about making sense of it. So it may not ultimately be about an action particularly, but making sense of it, learning about it, understanding it, talking to other people, getting support. That's still an active response. So by active, we don't necessarily mean taking the world on. That can be appropriate sometimes, but also can be too emotionally draining and actually cause incredible backlash in some circumstances. I think the worst case scenario is just letting it happen and not even reflecting on it. Yeah, that's a great comment about, I think there are probably ways of challenging, of being an ally, that help minimise the special attention. It can help to say something as a question rather than a statement. Again, that's that being open to understanding and listening rather than assuming. So thank you, Fran, for that comment. But now I'm going to introduce you to our two laureates today. And I believe that both Jacqueline and Lydia are going to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that emerge when working in an interdisciplinary way, because this can invoke some of these identity sorts of challenges that we've been talking about, but in this from a more disciplinary perspective. So first up, we will have ARC Laureate Fellow Jacqueline Peel, who's the director of the Melbourne Climate Futures and a professor at the Melbourne Law School. And Jacqueline is a leading expert. She's a laureate. She's a leading expert in climate change law. And you can see her bio there. So we'll hear from Jacqueline in just a moment. And then after Jacqueline, we'll have ARC Laureate Fellow Lydia Moraska, and sorry, Lydia, I still don't know how to pronounce your name, who is an ARC Laureate Fellow from QUT. And what's lovely is that we have Jacqueline from the social science perspective, but we have Lydia as a physicist working on this incredibly important topic of air quality and health. So coming from a bit of the more hard science disciplines, talking to us after that. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my slides and we are going to go to Jacqueline. So welcome.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for the invitation to be on this seminar today. As Sharon said, when I thought about this topic, I thought about it in the context of my own research, where some of the questions about intersection really sit in terms of different disciplines or working across different sectors. So that's the framing that I'm going to use. I'm just going to share some slides just to walk through my thinking with you on some of those and look forward to any questions that you might have. So you'll see there from the first slide that my context of research is about looking at climate action, which of course is a question about how we change systems and indeed some of the embedded inequalities in those systems. And when I'm thinking about how to approach these sorts of questions in research, the ones that really stand out for me is things where um, I've found some challenges, but also hopefully some solutions are about how we go across different disciplines. In my case, as a humanities researcher into the other areas of disciplinary expertise around climate, a lot of which are located in the science. How we cross across different sectors, and in that case, I'm talking about moving from academia to engage with stakeholders, whether they're in industry or government. But also, I think all of that for me has been overlaid with gender. So, challenges that come up for women in research. And just reflecting on some of my personal experiences in that regard. So, in terms of this sort of interdisciplinary challenge, of course, just a definition here of what we're talking about with interdisciplinary research, a mode of research, often by teams, sometimes by individuals, with integration of information, data, techniques, tools, perspectives, concepts, or theories from two or more disciplines or bodies of specialised knowledge, with the idea of advancing fundamental understanding or solving problems whose solutions are beyond the scope of a single discipline or area of research practice. So the orientation of interdisciplinary research is really that there is more beyond one particular person's knowledge or discipline to help solve problems. And so it's necessarily a boundary crossing exercise. If you're located in universities or research sector, then you know that there are lots of pressures to engage in interdisciplinary research. I think just about every university has a policy that encourages interdisciplinary research or attempts to place weighting on that in terms of career progression. And there are some funding incentives as well through systems like the ARC in terms of favouring interdisciplinary research. It's also basically a good way of solving complex challenges. I'd say in the climate area, there's no challenge that you can deal with that doesn't benefit from an interdisciplinary approach. And there is the potential also to achieve better outcomes that will speak to a wider range of groups. And this is really about integrating experiences and also perspectives from more than just one discipline also means that you can, that the research is likely to have broader impact. So there are lots of reasons why we might be encouraged to do interdisciplinary research, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. Um, so there are often different ways you can approach interdisciplinary research if this is something that you're interested to do. And I think it's important to think about at what stage of your career it's going to be easier or harder to do particular kinds of interdisciplinary research. So often when you're starting out a research career, the idea of just borrowing concepts or methods from other disciplines to enhance your own research and broaden your perspectives and outcomes is a good first step to introducing how to do this kind of research. That often progresses through just curiosity about knowing more about what other people are doing to problem-oriented research and collaboration. places where you come together in a team, usually with people drawn from different disciplines, sometimes all within HASS or sometimes all within STEM, or in the most ambitious versions are going across both sorts of sets of disciplines. I think the hardest kind of interdisciplinary research, and not one that I think I've reached this standard of interdisciplinary research, is actually conceptualising and developing a new field. And sometimes that's called transdisciplinary research, because you're actually transcending disciplinary boundaries altogether to come up with new forms of knowledge. So there are many different varieties, if you like, of interdisciplinary research. But it is a challenging form of research because it's about having to forego, to some extent, your disciplinary identity and be open to embracing the disciplinary identities of others. So some of the challenges that arise there, I took these from some of the questions that were submitted prior to the workshop, and we might come back and revisit some of these too. How to build trust and shared understanding where you're working across disciplines, how you can ensure equitable contributions and recognition if not everybody's contributing from the same disciplinary perspective, and the impact of differences in research methodologies, terminology and goals. So I'll just offer some brief reflections there, and I think Lydia's going to also pick up some of these same questions. I think the main thing about trust and shared understanding, it's not a revolutionary insight, but it does need time and iterative interactions to build trust and shared understanding. I really dislike it when universities in particular stick a whole lot of people into a room and say, okay, now be interdisciplinary. And in my experience, that doesn't usually work because you don't know and trust the other people around you. I think also not everybody likes this mode of doing research. It does require people with intellectual curiosity about what exists beyond the boundaries of their own experience, and humility. So that ability to sort of park your own assumptions and prejudices, and to engage from a position where you're open to learning. Equitable contributions can sometimes be very hard to navigate in an interdisciplinary context. It again requires a very clear work plan and allocation of roles. One thing I've found very useful in this context is to have a strategy from the outset where there are going to be publications for each of the team members in their respective disciplinary journals, and they get to lead on that particular publication as a way of creating equity across the group. And in terms of those disciplinary differences about methodology and terminology, they're alive and well and can't be underestimated. I think sometimes when you do this kind of research, half the time is spent, and productively spent, in discussing how we in fact understand the same word to mean different things depending on the perspective that we're coming from. So the key thing is that you need to talk and you need to trust each other to be able to do this kind of research. It's very similar when it comes to going across different sectors. Again, this is something that we often get urged to do. There are good reasons to do it, to engage with community, to engage with government and industry. It can certainly have real benefits in terms of the scale and the impact and real world implementation of the research. But again, it has its own set of challenges. This is just some quick tips for what I've found helps in this kind of navigating different intersections. Co-design of research questions being really important. And I've often used things like roundtables or focus groups or forums to understand needs and together define a clear question for the research. And often a shared specific goal is better than a common cause. So in the climate sphere, there may be a lot of agreement, for example, about the desirability of increasing ambition and action on climate change, but that doesn't always lead to shared goals and a clear research question. The other thing is careful selection of partners. Again, a theme around knowing and trusting who you're working with, and that's usually best created when people work together early and spend time learning about each other. And I've found it's useful to start small and scale up with those things. Again, being told to go and create millions of partnerships and expecting that will yield effective research usually is ineffective, but starting with one, creating trust and then building up that through a small project and then a bigger project can be very effective. And overall, I think, as with many things in life, it's the journey, not a destination. A partnership is something that requires good communication and regular review and check-in. And the most effective partnerships I've had for research are ones where there's an investment of time and energy and good communication channels there. So I think, again, in the document that was shared, there were some challenges that were posed about, well, okay, this all sounds really good to do this kind of research, but how do I build these kind of connections? And particularly if you're dealing with a situation where you've got many intersecting identities, that you might feel less confident about building those connections. And bridging the gap between sort of our assumptions in academia versus in industry or government. I do think building connections does come down to some good old-fashioned networking, and I'd be the first to say that I am not the best networker in the sense of the pressing the flesh at conferences. I find that very intimidating, but using your LinkedIn very effectively. Engaging with people one-on-one in smaller groups can sometimes be a really effective way to build those connections.
Jackie, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just conscious of time. Can I just ask you to wrap up in about a minute, just so that we've got some time for Lydia and questions, if that's okay?
Of course.
Thank you.
I'm about to do so, and I just
Excellent.
wanted to say final slide. Sharon, was just challenges for women researchers, and in my context, thinking about how to balance the career with family. I don't have any solutions there, but I'm just suggesting that over time, some of the challenges can change in nature. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And I love how you talked about the importance of humility when you were talking about this interdisciplinary collaboration, because in essence, that is also what we're saying around working with people with different sorts of intersectional identities is humility and not assuming you know everything and being open to listen and ask. So thank you so much. Lydia, I'm just going to ask if you have some additional comments you would like to make before we get into some questions.
Well, I was going to say thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this, and Jacqueline for an excellent presentation. What I was going to do is to tell the listeners a little bit about myself, and then some comments about this topic of being interdisciplinary, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I'm a physicist, a nuclear physicist, and that's what I decided that I would be when I was a little girl. Why? I don't know. I was born in Poland and got my degrees in Poland. Then from Poland, I went to Canada for a postdoc. And I went with my husband and two daughters, 4 and 9 at the time. 2 weeks before we left for this fellowship, my husband was diagnosed with melanoma. And the 4 years we spent in Canada, that disease kind of was stable, then progressed. And then I got an offer for a position here at QUT. After we moved to Australia, my husband passed away a year after this. Well, I built up my research team, which is, well, I said I was nuclear physicist, but I lead my research team in International Laboratory for Air Quality and Health, which you may ask how it is related one to another. That's where the interdisciplinary aspect comes from. So in this journey, what worked for me was the upbringing at home with both parents educated, and there was never a question that as a girl, as a woman, I cannot do something. So it was absolutely obvious. So that confidence that, well, it will be my will, what I want to do, and I would pursue this. That was one very important, and that confidence, that's something for everybody is the key thing. Never lose confidence. Sometimes it may be easier to say than actually execute, but always think about confidence. Then the issue of really pursuing what I want to do. When it's so, my parents absolutely accepted that I will be a nuclear physicist. Nobody questioned this. But when it actually got to the point of applying for university, the discussion started where, are you sure you know what you are doing? Because at the time there was only one nuclear reactor in Poland. So the question was, okay, where are you going to find a job in this situation? And I remember we went even with my mom to the dean of that faculty. But I stuck with this. I thought that's my interest and I'm going to do this. Of course, the family accepted this, which was a very good decision. That nuclear reactor, I didn't need it because in the meantime, my career kind of broadened and broaden into environmental radioactivity and then particles in the air and air quality research. But I was doing this and I was doing what I was interested in doing. So this was the most interesting. Then when we were in Canada on one occasion, a mom of one of my daughter's friends asked me just like a passing, well, why did you choose such an non-feminine profession? Then I thought, what is she saying? It never came across my mind that there's a profession with feminine or not feminine. Again, it probably goes back to that upbringing, but again, you can never think that something you are boxed in something. If you are interested in something, there's nothing for men and women. Then there was one moment when I was already here at QUT and I started lecture. I never lectured before, so that was the first lecture. So it was a transition because while I was fluent in English, and then thanks to my father who came up with a very good idea how to teach us, me and my sister, English, but I didn't necessarily know the terminology, so it was a journey. There was a class of students, mainly female students, radiologists, and they had to take that unit in physics. They didn't think that they needed this, but they had to do it. They were extremely disruptive, about 70 of them, very disruptive, which was very difficult. And on one occasion, I walked with one of them who wanted to get something from my office, so one-on-one, I was, tell me, why are you so disruptive? And she said just like this, well, we can't understand you, so we talk. And I thought about this, and then I realized it's not that you cannot understand me, you don't like my accent, but you do understand me. Because then I thought from other students, particularly international students, that they understood me better than they understood native Australian speakers. So these were those moments but in a moment like this, you must have your confidence and you can tolerate things to a certain point and to find out what are the reasons for things, for what people do, for situations. But after you realize what they are, and that is something you cannot put up with this because it's not what you want, well, that's it. You cannot put it up and you have to decide on the course of action. But you have to be very clear to yourself. These are my values, this who I am, and this what I want to do. And I'm going to a point, and past that point, I cannot go any further. Then coming to interdisciplinary research, everything what I do. And
Lydia, sorry to interrupt you, but I think we're probably all curious how you responded to this event, or what did you decide to do as a consequence of it?
I don't remember my specific response because I couldn't. It was not really a response to tell her, well, you should do better, or you should be. I don't remember my specific response, but it reassured me that I have to persevere, and I devised my ways of dealing with the situation. So when the class was disruptive again, I asked them once, twice, the third time. to be quiet. If this didn't work, I warned them that was one of the methods. I've warned them that if it continues, I'll just leave the class, but they would have to finish. They would learn without me teaching. So there were a few ideas which eventually worked, but I made sure that I was calm, composed, and I was on the top of this. Well, that's
Thank
what
you, Lydia. You know, what you've shared there is actually a good example of an active response. And it's an example of sense making. And, you know, so somebody was saying sometimes if you react and fight, it can cause backlash. But my response was that active response can also be about making sense. And that's sort of what you did. It sounds to me like you made sense, you reflected, you thought about it, you came out more determined, you developed a strategy, etc. And that's an active response as opposed to just letting it slide and ignore. So that's a really good example of the point. Look, I know you want to talk about interdisciplinarity, but I'm going to jump across to Annika, if that's okay, who's primed with some questions. So we will come back to you and you'll get the opportunity to weave some of those thoughts into the responses. So Annika, everybody, I believe you've all met Annika before, who's doing a PhD with me here at Curtin University, and she is going to probably share the Slido, hopefully. But thank you so much, Lydia. And Jacqueline, stay here. We're going to have some questions for you in just a moment. Over to you, Annika.
Yes, let me share my screen. Can everyone see the results of the Slido? So as you already mentioned, share and gender was the most rated one, followed by age and race. So it's actually no surprise that the most research on the topic is also on these, but there are a lot more factors that were voted for. So socioeconomic status, language, like we just talked about, mental health, attractiveness, body size, over to education. So it's actually relevant in all these categories. And following up on the language barrier that we just briefly touched upon, we also had a question on that from someone asking, how do we make doing research with others from different cultures and with different languages inclusive, especially when there's a cultural majority within the group that's non-English native, and how do we make sure that there are no subgroups forming due to language barriers. So maybe Lydia, would you like to start answering this question?
Well, I'd say that in my experience, we had an opposite situation, because the vast majority of my PhD students and postdocs and staff were from different countries. For some reason, few native Australians want to do PhD in this area. So therefore, on one occasion, we had a whole map of the world showing where we come from. So this situation basically never occurred, that they were majority of English native speakers. So it has always been a mix, and this mix worked very well. Doesn't mean that they weren't specific issues between specific individuals, but this was not because of language, but because of, well, all kinds of other things.
Yeah, Jacqueline, would you like to add something to that?
I was interested to hear Lydia's response, but I think it does come back to this sort of openness to difference, and trying to cultivate that in the team from the very start. So if you don't have that as an understanding, it's very hard to sort of accommodate and help different people from different cultures, different perspectives really contribute equally to a team.
Sharon,
Maybe,
do you have any?
I could just quickly add. I think sometimes these challenges are aided by having a very clear shared goal that's beyond, the individual. So it might be people working together on a research project or working on an improvement initiative in the organization or whatever. But sometimes if you've got a very clear shared goal, then you've sort of got to cooperate and learn and get to know each other. And that's often also where you see the strengths of other people and so on. So So, you know, if that's something that's happening in your workplace, you probably have to orchestrate some strategies for addressing it, I think. I don't think you should just assume that it's A, okay, and B will just go away, because it probably won't. I think it's important to think about how to build that stronger sense of shared purpose that crosses those boundaries.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We also have some comments in our chat about this. Michelle mentioned that even if your first language is English, but you're not Australian, or you have an accent, that can also be, you can be affected by it, even if English is your first language. So thank you everyone so much for your interaction in the chat. I'm going to move on with another question, which is related to how to manage the power relations. So if you are have a relation with your male white line manager, who obviously has discriminatory traits or doesn't treat you with respect, like, do you have any strategies or suggestions of how to deal with that? Maybe also, Lydia, from a male-dominated field perspective, do you have any strategies or suggestions?
I must say that I didn't have this kind of experience, that a male boss was treating me as a woman in a way which wasn't right. More, it's, I would say, a boys' club which wanted something, and one of the issues we had were the issue of space for the laboratory. So, and that space, we had a laboratory, that space was taken away, or was being taken away. So it was not necessary, it was taken away from me, but it was to give it to somebody else, because that boys' club was seen this more appropriate. This was probably one of the lowest points of, well, I wouldn't say of my career, because it was, but and I realized that this was at that point, I couldn't do anything. I was actually at the point of leaving the university, but eventually I talked with a person higher than this, who clearly appreciate what I was doing. So it's not the issue was resolved, but the issue was kind of stabilized. But that's how we existed with the lab, which was smaller, much smaller than it should be. But well, I persevered with what I was wanted to do, and eventually with grants, with the laureate, now we have one of the best labs at the university. So it always that you should see, is this a battle? Is this against you? Is it what? And how to react to this, and assess the situation and act accordingly. And then if this is a wall, work around this wall and continue working towards your, well, destination.
Yeah, Jacqueline, do you have anything to add?
I've had some of those similar experiences, particularly if you're a little bit younger and you move into leadership positions. You do tend to notice the bigger gender gap as you go up the leadership rungs. And I have been in meetings where I was a professor but asked if I was the PhD student preparing the notes on the meeting. I think thoughts of that, and that can be very confronting. You sort of feel like your whole expertise is being devalued. The main response that I've found is just really showing them effectively how really good you are, and then there's a level of respect that generates that competency and efficiency. And it might not seem fair that you sort of have to demonstrate that while it's assumed of some others, but it can be effective, and also enlisting allies who can provide you with a community of support and share those experiences too.
Yeah, Sharon, would you like to add
something? Maybe I'd just add that specific question. It's, you know, we don't have time to go into the detail, but it sounds like it may even be verging on harassment. We do have a Women in Research whole discussion on harassment and the different informal and formal ways of dealing with it. And, you know, I I emphasize that they don't have to be formal, because formal ways can be very scary. And, you know, people are worried about career consequences and so on. But there are some more informal ways, potentially, you know, getting an ally, having a quiet word, you know, getting someone more senior to have a quiet word, and so on. So I just encourage the person who asked that question to look back at our old Women in Research sessions, because there's one on harassment that might be perfect.
Yeah.
But thank you for the question, and I feel sorry that we still are answering these sorts of questions these days, but it's unfortunately still too common.
Yeah, thank you so much for flagging that, Sharon, and actually, yeah, not forgetting about that there are still issues we are dealing with as women. And this is also why we have this webinar, right? So we can all be our allies. Every time we do these sessions, we all feel like a little bit stronger because we kind of are all in this together. So I think it's a great way of, yeah, sharing and not being alone. Maybe one last thing that we could finish off with is a question also from the audience, which is, how can I ensure my unique experiences are seen as strengths rather than limitations? I think Jacqueline already touched upon that a little bit. But Lydia, do you have some thoughts on that too?
Well, I'm not sure whether there's a prescription for this, but this goes back to that confidence. Confidence, if you are confident that that's what it is, then you kind of share this confidence and not losing this confidence despite what people say, despite what you sometimes may think that's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, Lydia, Jacqueline, sorry, do you have something to add to that?
I think sometimes there is some similarities here with going across disciplines in terms of not assuming that everybody understands and has the same knowledge. So in fact, sharing what unique experiences you've had and the values and strengths that they create is really a helpful educational experience often for others in the team, as long as there's not hostility around you sharing that. But if you've got a sort of open environment where you feel you can put that information forward, I think it's really great for the rest of the people that you're working with.
Yeah. Sharon, would you like to add something to that too?
Well, first, just to reiterate, I think making people aware of your strengths is really important, because, and even actually reflecting on your strengths yourself, you know, doing that self-reflection, because I think sometimes what are our strengths are so easy and obvious for us that we sometimes don't even realize that they're strengths. So I think having the self-awareness, first of all, of what your strengths are, letting other people know. But I'd also say finding ways to use your strengths, finding creative ways and opportunities to use your strengths, because that's how you're going to get that competence and show people that they're there. And if you just hide them under a bushel, people are not going to know. So if you're great at public speaking, find opportunities to speak publicly in your department. You know, if it's even telling people about the fire drill, you know, who cares? But find those opportunities to showcase your strengths. So I think, Annika, we might be at the end of the session. I'm just before everyone jumps off, I just want to share my final screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yes,
you can.
So look, guys, first of all, we actually amazingly have 2 minutes, which is very rare. We're normally jumping off with 10 seconds. But first of all, thank you so much, Jacqueline and Lydia, for coming on. I hope you've enjoyed being part of Women in Research, and love to have you back going, because we'd never get time to cover everything. Maybe we should have a special session on interdisciplinary work, actually occurred to me when we were talking. So thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Annika, for your great question answering. Thank you to the women behind the scenes that you don't see, Eleanor and Isabel. And thank you, of course, to all of you for coming. If you've got ideas for topics for next year, let us know. But I would love to just wish you all a wonderful festive season. I hope that you get a break. We all work too hard, so I hope that you get a break and come back re-energized in the new year. But thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely comments that I can see have been occurring on the web. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.